What is art history? Art history is the study of works of art and art objects in their historical context. A work of art is an object or performance of aesthetic importance that was created by humans. An art object is an artifact of aesthetic importance. However, an art object was not necessarily intended by the creator to be a work of art. For instance, the object may have been used in religious ritual and was not considered an art object until historians many years later classified it as one. An example of this is this Greek funerary crater from the Greek geometric period, which dates to 750 BCE. The object was created for use in a burial ritual. The creators didn't intend it to be an object of aesthetic contemplation placed in a museum. It was used within a religious ritual. However, since then, art historians have classified it as an art object of aesthetic importance, and its function has changed. An example of an artwork that was created solely for a museum is Eva Hesse's Repetition 19-1 from 1967 that was made of paper mache on aluminum screening. Hesse explored repetition as a compositional strategy, and so here she employed very lightweight, fragile materials such as paper mache and aluminum screening and made it look as though they were hardy ceramic objects. Again, her interest was in repetition as a compositional strategy, and this artwork can really only be understood within the context of minimalism in the 20th century. Now we are going to discuss the term aesthetic. And that means something that is concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty, and a set of principles underlying and guiding the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. Originally derived from the Greek term meaning sensitive or eye, think, feel, perceive, the term was adopted by the German Alexander Baumgarten in 1735 to mean the science of beauty. The Greeks developed this term aesthetic and also developed Western philosophy, and in their contemplation really dealt with notions of representation, with creation, with imitation, and with transcendence. So we have two different camps here, Plato versus Aristotle, which can be categorized in these kind of using these broad terms, or idea versus imitation, and abstraction versus mimesis. And the term mimic comes from the term mimesis, and that means to literally mimic what you see. So here we see our two guys, Plato on the left pointing up to the sky, and Aristotle on the left pointing down to the ground. This image is taken from Raphael's painting School of Athens that was painted during the High Renaissance. And the notions of Plato and Aristotle and these two different schools of thought were very important to Renaissance artists and Renaissance thinkers. So for Plato, he felt that artists were beyond imitation and that they were trying to convey something that was not of this world. So he wasn't interested or felt that it was the role of the artist to depict what we see around us. Instead, he dealt with this notion of the Platonic ideal. So to give you an example of the Platonic ideal and how that relates to art is we'll use a chair as an example. So the Platonic ideal of the chair is the idea made by God. And then on earth, the carpenter, in imitation of God's idea, creates a chair that functions. Then a painter might come along and paint a chair. And so the artist has then made an imitation of the carpenter's object. And so here, the painter's representation is twice removed from God's idea. And so a representation of an object in art is an interpretation. It's not an imitation. The carpenter is imitating this notion, this ideal notion of a chair, but the painter is interpreting it. Aristotle, on the other hand, was very interested in mimesis and felt that mimesis, through the use of mathematical ideas and symmetry, could create the perfect imitation of nature, and that that was divine. And so he wanted to search for the perfect, the timeless, and contrast being with becoming. And this is in contrast to nature, which is full of change, decay, and cycles. But he felt that art could transcend this by finding this perfect imitation of the real world. And Aristotle considered it important that there be a certain distance between the work of art on the one hand and life on the other. So even though he is interested in mimesis and wants to represent and imitate life, he believes that it should be an idealized version of life, and that there should be a separation between life and art, so that you can achieve a catharsis and a transcendent experience through that. And that's what these philosophers were interested in, and it has greatly influenced art. And you can see this in two strains of artistic approach that we see throughout time. First, we have the aesthetic of ideas. And with this, words that can identify this are abstraction, the concept is paramount, and the idea is the art. So here we have an example of the Palette of Narmer from the first dynasty Egyptian culture from 3000 BCE. This is one of the earliest hieroglyphics found, and it depicts the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by King Narmer. And so we have here as an example of hierarchical scale. So if you notice in the center of the image, we have this very large figure, and all the figures around it, however, are very small. Well, that's because that center figure is King Narmer, and this is called hierarchical scale. The fact that he is larger than everything else on the stele denotes that he is the figure of the most importance. So the Egyptians, through uses of symbols and iconography, which is symbols have meaning and they are telling a story, the Egyptians are telling the story of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt through King Narmer, and they're doing that through images. So this is meant to be read as though it were a text. And there's different conventions that you use to create that. So for instance, if you look, the figure is simultaneously in profile but also facing us. The head and the legs are in profile, but the torso is facing us. That is completely an unnatural position that none of us can stand in. But the reason why they're doing that is because that particular view gives us the most visual information possible. Because again, it's about the storytelling. It's not about imitating or mimicking real life. And this is what's called a visual convention. It's not this visual convention of the geometric perspective where you have the simultaneous profile and head-on view is something that is used across Egyptian art. And again, it's because this work of art, it's not about mimesis or representing real life, but it's about telling a story and using visual conventions to do so and using images to do so. And this is something that we see not only as early as the Egyptians, but we also see throughout time. So this notion of the aesthetics of ideas, that's in alignment, obviously this predates Plato when he is discussing his philosophies in ancient Greece, which is thousands of years later, but it's very relevant in that we see these across time, this notion of the aesthetic of ideas contrasts with the aesthetics of form. Here we have the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, also known as the large glass, and this is an artwork produced by the artist Marcel Duchamp, who worked in the 20th century, the 19-teens, through his death in the 1960s. He is considered a Dada artist and a conceptual artist. And this is intended to depict the erotic encounter between the bride and her 9 bachelors. Obviously, that isn't easily seen with the images that he has. So the bride is represented up here in the upper register as this cloud and these ethereal forms, and the 9 bachelors are represented down below. So again, and it plays well off the Stele of Narmer because you have these registers, the upper and the lower, which if you notice in the Stele of Narmer, there's also that. But I also bring your attention to this crack in the work, and this crack was created by accident, and it was created when the museum actually in transport, they were packing it, unloading it, and it cracked. And Duchamp, who was a Dadaist, who was part of, and that group was very anarchist and interested in chance as a way to create artwork, said that that finally completed the work. So that's why the work is dated from 1915 to 1923. And that's when the crack occurred in 1923. So here we have this example of conceptual art where the idea is paramount, and this aesthetics of ideas, which can can stretch back to the Egyptians, but is employed in different ways throughout time. This is called the Treason of Images, and this is by surrealist artist René Magritte, who's also considered a Dada artist, from 1929. It's oil on canvas. So here we have a realistic depiction of a pipe, and underneath it in French is the phrase "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," and that simply means this is not a pipe. But we're looking at a pipe, so why would he write that? Well, this is about, going back to Plato, Magritte's really dealing with notions of representation and perception, how we perceive things. It's actually not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. It's not an actual pipe. And so Magritte is playing with how we perceive meaning and how we interpret our environment. So we know a pipe is a pipe through a painting of a pipe. We know a pipe is a pipe through a sentence that is denoting a pipe, as in the sentence below, that the word pipe is that is also referring to a form of the pipe. And then we have the actual pipe, which is not present. So he's really dealing with, again, these issues of human perception and understanding of our world. And this goes back to that notion of Plato and this Platonic ideal that the artist is interpreting an object, and it's two representations removed from this idea, this Platonic idea of a pipe. Transitioning to the aesthetics of form, which is a sort of the counterbalance to the aesthetics of ideas that is seen throughout history and the history of art. And this refers to abstraction, imitation or the simulation of nature. Beauty is achieved through form and representation, and form is central to the art. So first up on the left, we have the Apollo Belvedere, which is made from marble. It is a Roman copy of the Greek original, and the Apollo is a depiction of the Greek god Apollo. The Greek version was created in 350 BCE, and the Roman version was created in 130 to 140 CE. And here we have the depiction of the Greeks were interested in depicting the perfect human form. So they're looking to nature, they're imitating nature, but they're also imitating nature to create this perfect, idealized version of the human body, this Greek god figure, because that is, they wanted to transcend, and that was a way to connect with the divine. Now here we have John James Audubon's Golden Eagle from 1833, and Audubon was a scientist, and he went out in the field and he created drawings, and he created sketches and paintings of animals that he would see, and he wrote a book on it. And then to produce the book, they made prints, lithographic prints of his paintings. So Audubon was looking to create and imitate nature, but he was doing it from a scientific perspective. He was doing it because he wanted to have the most information possible so that people can scientifically observe and understand the Golden Eagle, which is a different objective than obviously what the Greeks and the Romans were doing with the Apollo Belvedere, but using the same type of representational style, using form, imitation, simulating and trying to represent nature, essentially. And he did this too because at the time, photography was very young, and you now would use photography, but you could not use it then because the cameras were not that portable. It's very hard to take images. So this is a contemporary artist, Chuck Close. This is a big self-portrait from 1967 to 68. And I want you guys to take a quick minute and guess what the medium of this artwork is. Is it a photograph? Is it a painting? Is it a film still? Is it a sculpture? Is it a print? If you said photograph, you were wrong. It's actually a painting. It's acrylic on canvas. Close was part of this movement in the 60s and the 70s called photorealism, where they worked from photographs. So he took a photograph of himself and then created that down to the most minute detail in paint. So instead of working from like a live model in the studio, he was working from photographs to recreate this image. And so you might ask, well, what's the point? Why repaint something that was already photographed? But that's something we will talk about, the motivations behind, say, the photorealist painters. That has a lot to do with painting reasserting itself with the advent of photography. So now we're going to briefly discuss art history as a discipline. This is our founding father, Johann Winckelmann, an attractive guy, don't you think? And in 1764, Winckelmann wrote 2 books, Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Art and Painting and the History of Ancient Art. And he wrote this during the Enlightenment, which was when he was alive and working. His books essentially introduced the modern art historical method of describing and classifying works of art on the basis of style. 19th century art historians tended to view art as evolutionary, and this attitude was influenced by Darwin's work in biology as much as historical thought of this time. So what I'm trying to say is that the way in which we study art history and classify it has its roots in dominant modes of thought when the discipline was created, which was in the 18th and 19th centuries. So methodical classification and taxonomy were methods of study across all disciplines during the Enlightenment. In other words, art historians wanted to take the history of art that they thought looked like this and make it look like this. When in reality, it looks more like this. And this brings us to the notion of the canon. So in their effort to organize art history, you had to create a canon to do so. So in order to make it logical and chronological, you had to create what is known as a canon, which is the agreed upon set of criteria to organize and study art. The canon is defined by classification of periods and styles set in a chronological order, i.e. evolution. And this is to construct a logical narrative to understand the history of art. This resulted in a set of artists, artwork styles, and media that are considered of primary importance to art. However, starting in the 20th century, there was a push to reevaluate the canon of art history in order to include art that was left out of the story. The canon is Western-centric and patriarchal, meaning it emphasizes the work and culture of males of European descent, because that is a demographic that has held power in Western society. Now we look at the history of art as an interconnected web and not a strict chronological timeline. We include art produced by various non-Western cultures, and we examine art produced by women throughout time, and we look at the culture and art of minorities. So a group of artists called the Guerrilla Girls, which came out of the feminist art movement, created this artwork, which was actually a billboard that they posted all around New York City. So feminist artists were interested in readdressing the canon of art and to look at including works of by women artists that were not known and not included in the canon. So here they have a poster that states, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Less than 3% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 83% of the nudes are female." And here we have an image of Ingres, a very famous 18th century French painter, his odalisque, which is the figure in the foreground, the nude figure, and the odalisque is essentially a high-end prostitute. And she and the Gorilla Girls have put a gorilla mask on top of her that hides her head, obviously. And so here, the Gorilla Girls are really, this is a work of art, and they're using alternative methods that exist outside of the museum and tapping into graphic design and advertising as an effective way to convey their message, because art is this act of communication. So in dealing with the canon, they have this interest in assessing and pushing and critiquing and trying to understand why women have essentially been left out of the canon and why they have really only been represented as objects for the male gaze in the form of nude figures. So as we move through this course, we need to learn how to talk about art. That's one of the key things and one of the main course objectives that we will achieve with this course. So there are two sort of methods. There's formal description and formal analysis, and one builds on the other. Formal description deals with the obvious, it describes what the eye sees, and it's essentially the first step. So when I ask you to formally describe something, I'm asking you to tell me what you see when you're looking at the art object. Now there's specific terminology that you use, but that's basically what that is. Then you have formal analysis, which is the interpretation of the artwork. How does the work mean? You infer and form a thesis, an argument, based on what you see and understand. So that phrase, how does the work mean, is confusing. But you're not asking what does the work mean. You're asking how it means. So it has these sets, each artwork has a set of meanings, and you have to break it apart and figure out how it creates those meanings. And that's what formal analysis is. So you use your formal description, because if you can't describe the work, and we are in the discipline of art history, where words are stock in trade, you need to have a strong foundation in a written description of the work, and then you use that to interpret the work. So you break it down, and you analyze it, and you try to understand it. So in order to describe and analyze art, you must first know the terminology. What is style? Style is the defining characteristics of a certain period, movement of art, or of an individual artist. Form and composition. Form is the object's shape and structure. Composition is the manner in which the artwork is organized. Medium and technique. Medium or media, the plural, is the materials and or method used to create the artwork. Technique is the manner in which the tools and medium are employed. Line. Line deals with how shapes are formed. So you might have a very hard line. If you think about like a comic book, the contours are very distinct and very hard that outline the figures. But if you think about Impressionism, for example, those lines then become blurry. So then, and that's called a painterly approach to line. So we have to look at how line works. Is it angular? Is it geometric? Is it curvilinear? Is it organic? Why is the artist employing these types of lines? How does it relate to the overall style that the artist is working in? What meaning is being conveyed through the use of their use of line? Texture. Texture deals with the surface of the object. So if you immediately think of sculpture, for instance, you might have a very smooth marble sculpture. In contrast, you might have a very rough bronze sculpture. Bronze is usually cast to make the mold. It's cast from a mold. You make the mold from clay, so you can really manipulate the clay very easily and can give it this rough texture. Texture also applies to painting, because if you notice, the Northern Renaissance artists have an amazingly smooth surface, so much so that you can't identify individual brushstrokes at all. It's amazing. And this is in contrast, and we'll bring up the Impressionists again, where they basically ladle on, you can see their brushwork. They ladle on the paint. You can see the individual brushstrokes. Why are these techniques different? How do they represent the different time periods that they were created? Why were these artists using this? And that also can lead to impasto, which is where artists will actually slather paint on the surface of the canvas, and it makes the painting surface almost sculptural, because the paint is sticking out, and it creates a play of light and shadow. So not only in the painting do you have light and shadow created, but the texture of the painting actually can create that too. There's also space, mass, and volume. So when we talk about space, mass, and volume, I'll give you an example. When we talk about space, there's positive and negative space. So you might have a still life of an apple. The apple is the positive space, and the space surrounding the apple is the negative space. So we're going to see how artists employ different usages of positive and negative space. Same with mass. You know, sometimes there is such a realistic painting of an apple that you feel like you could just pick it up and that it's real and it has this weight to it and it feels real. That is a depiction of mass. Others, it might be a more schematic drawing of an apple that you say, I understand that that represents an apple, but that's just a pencil drawing that's just very minimal and I don't feel like I can pick that up. So that's one thing, one way of looking at mass and sort of how that's depicted. So space, mass, and volume can apply not only to sculpture, but also to two-dimensional works too. And we also have perspective and foreshortening, and this relates to our perception of space. So for instance, in Renaissance paintings, perspective was very important. They were very concerned with creating space that extended back into the picture plane so that you didn't notice that it was a flat surface that they were painting on, but instead the space receded far off into the distance. And foreshortening is one aspect of that, where you can actually, it's a technique that is used to create perspective on an object. So for instance, if you have somebody's hand laying on a table and that table is facing you, the artist might render the fingers larger, and as the hand and the arm recedes, it gets skinnier because normally in life, objects that are closest to you are larger, and objects that are farther away from you, as they recede, they get smaller. So an artist will employ that foreshortening to create a sense of perspective with a particular object. With proportion and scale, I will direct you back to the Palette of Narmer, where we saw the scale of the figures being completely different from one another. The hierarchical scale, where King Narmer was the largest figure and all of the other figures were completely out of scale with him. And so artists will sometimes try to render accurate scale, but artists will also use scale as a way to tell a story and use scale as a way to deal with different concerns. Subject matter is what is being depicted in the artwork. So in the Palette of Narmer, the subject matter there was the story of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by King Narmer. However, in the self-portrait by Chuck Close, the subject matter for that, it was the artist's face, essentially. So subject matter can range from complex stories all the way to very simple, matter-of-fact representations of objects. So now we will discuss representational styles. And so representational styles refer to the manner in which the artist chooses to represent whatever they are depicting. So you can have, on the naturalistic side or the mimetic side or the Aristotelian side, we have idealism and naturalism. So idealism would be if you were, say you are painting the face of an old man. Idealized version of the man would be something that made him look strong and young and smooth, and it would be an idealized version of him. It would be not necessarily an image that depicts the reality, but instead it's trying to achieve this higher ideal. Whereas if you were depicting the old man naturalistically, you would have every wrinkle and crevice and blemish on the man's face, and really sort of depicting and rendering what's actually there. And so even within mimetic forms of representation, there's still a variance that can range from sort of idealized imagery to more naturalistic imagery. And this is in contrast, obviously, to sort of the more abstract sort of strand of representation, and to abstraction and geometric patterning are examples of such, where you have shapes and forms that aren't necessarily identifiable in real life, but may represent something. So you can have, you know, geometric forms, you can have naturalistic forms, etc.